We have Brees and Ramondre falling like a rock. We have Jacobs looking like he's good to go week 1. So we have a lot of updating that we need to do with these top 30 rankings. But guys at 1 and 2, they're going to stay the same. You're tired of hearing me talk about Jefferson and Chase, right? I mean, every single time we say, okay, yeah, worst case scenario, they're top 5 wide receivers in fantasy. Best case scenario, these guys go out there and they have over 2,000 receiving yards this season. I truly do think that's in the range of outcomes. If you look at Jefferson, the man was the best 23-year-old wide receiver we've ever seen. Yes, better than Calvin Ridley. Yes, better than Randy Moss. He was the wide receiver 2 from a fantasy points per game perspective at 23 years old. If you go over to Jamar Chase, I mean, Chase had a better second season than Justin Jefferson from a bunch of different measuring statistics. If you look at his target share in year 2, he was at a 31% mark from a per game perspective. Now, of course, the total points weren't really there for Chase because he got injured, but you're not really expecting Chase to have to deal with an injury again this next season. Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to be looking at Christian McCaffrey at 3. With CMC, nobody's going to deny the ceiling, right? You go back to 2019, 150 total yards per game. Hell, even this past year, he won me a $100,000 tournament on Underdog. He won me another $20,000 tournament on Underdog Fantasy. He is someone that I'm rooting for. Now, he's going to split the backfield with Elijah Mitchell. I mean, if you look at the 4 games that CMC played with Mitchell last season, he was at 10.5 rushing attempts per game in comparison to 15.5 attempts per game with no Elijah. But to be fair, you're not really drafting Christian McCaffrey for his first and second down workload. You are drafting Christian McCaffrey for his receiving down volume. Hit a 21% team target share last season. Now, our next guy with Travis Kelce at 4 is going to be extremely dependent on your league format and where you decide to take him. Now, of course, we all know he's the tight end 1 in fantasy. Nobody's arguing against that. Really, the only red flag is the fact that he's going to be 34 years old this next season. But with that being said, I still think you take Kelce at a very high point in your draft under a couple different circumstances. 1, if you are playing in a 10-team league or fewer, you push up the elite tight ends, you push up the elite level quarterbacks. 2, if you play in a league where you can only start up to 3 wide receivers total, aka a league where you have 2 starting wide receivers and 1 flex, then you push up the elite level tight end because he's going to make up a higher percentage of your starting lineup output overall. Now, of course, if you're playing in like a 12-team, 14-team format where you're starting 3 wide receivers and a couple flexes, there you probably want to be punting tight end. But we're making this video as a 12-team PPR league where you start 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, and 1 to 2 flex spots. I'll tell you how to adjust later on. Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to be looking at Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, back-to-back. I'm going to with Tyreek last season. He was incredible with Tua. He averaged 108 receiving yards per game in the games that Tua played it. Now, of course, in the games with no Tua, he was not that good, 75 receiving yards per game, but you expect Tua to play this next season. You'll see that with our Waddle ranking later on. With Cooper Kupp at 6, we are really hoping we actually get to see him back at practice this week. Reports are saying that he will be back, but I'll believe it when we see it. I mean, it's always a little concerning drafting a 30-year-old wide receiver that's dealing with the hamstring injury, even if he arguably has a higher ceiling than anybody else in this tier. Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to look at Bijan Robinson. Now, everybody knows the man is a monster. Everybody knows that he has the frame to be a 3-down running back. I mean, hell, look at him standing next to us. I don't know if y'all know this about me, but I'm 6'6", 280 pounds of pure muscle. And yeah, Bijan Robinson, I mean, is actually about my same size. Yeah, so you don't have to worry about him handling a 3-down workload at all. But with Bijan, what's most exciting is the receiving down skill set. If you're looking at Bijan Robinson, he averaged 16.5 yards per reception his final season at the University of Texas. He does not just see dump-offs out the backfield. Bijan Robinson runs real routes. He could be a slot wide receiver if you wanted to. Now, I understand last time you drafted a rookie this high, it was Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and yeah, that didn't work out for you. But with Bijan, I mean, he is a significantly better prospect than Clyde Edwards-Helaire ever was. And if we look at all those other running backs that went round 1 of fantasy drafts as rookies, they all worked out. I mean, if you look at Saquon Barkley, he was the running back 2 in fantasy. Leonard Fournette, the running back 7. Ezekiel Elliott, the running back 3. Adrian Peterson, the running back 5. You have to be pumped about Bijan in my mind. Now, Eckler, our next guy, is a running back that, yes, we've lowered down these rankings a little bit. The reason being, the more I look into this Eckler profile, the more I am concerned. Now, of course, he was the #1 overall flex player last year. I mean, Austin Eckler was a phenomenal selection and will still probably be very good this next year. But if you go ahead and look at the road of his screener, every single running back going into their age 28 season that had a comparable 27-year-old year to Austin Eckler, they all got worse across the board. I mean, starting Curtis Martin, he goes from 19.1 points per game down to 18.8. You had David Johnson going from about 16 points per game down to 12. You had Deuce Staley going from 16 points per game down to 10. You had Lamont Jordan going from 21 points per game down to 8. You had Liddell Betts going from about 15 points per game down to 5. Now, of course, I don't expect Austin Eckler to go down to 5, 6, 7 points per game. But if we look at this continued trend, the data is clear. These 28-year-old running backs are getting worse with this kind of profile. And I'm also concerned about the receiving usage going down with these wide receivers being healthy in 2023. Also with the addition of Quentin Johnson in this offense. Now our next guy, Stefon Diggs, super stable. 3 straight seasons of a top 10 wide receiver finish. I mean, this is a wide receiver that's averaged a 27% team target share, 2.4 yards per route run, 110 intended air yards per game. Like, there's nothing that you can look at and try to make a red flag case for Stefon Diggs. He still has the elite level quarterback in Josh Allen. And of course, you know I love our guy Josh Allen, so I had to hook y'all up week 1 against the Jets. Everybody who signed up to Underdog with promo code FLOCK is going to get an exclusive special pick'em, more than less than half a passing yard for Josh Allen in that Monday night game. So please make sure you're taking advantage of that. And if you want to, it's not too late. We are drafting on Underdog Fantasy every single night on this live stream. If you want to get in a draft with us, or if you want to go check out any of those pick'ems or get that special exclusive Josh Allen one, you can find the link to Underdog in the comment section in the description of this video. Promo code FLOCK is going to get you a 100% deposit match, plus our 2023 fantasy football rankings, a free trial to flockfantasy.com where you can find our 2023 fantasy football draft guide. It's best ball, so no time commitment at all during the year. So I drafted 700 teams and won $150,000 last season. But going over to our next guy, we are going to be looking at CeeDee Lamb. And in that live stream, I actually had some people telling us, oh, CeeDee Lamb's not a good round 1 selection. I'm sitting here going, what the hell are you talking about? CeeDee Lamb was the wide receiver 7 from a points per game perspective last season. He is younger than Kenny Pickett. We expect him to naturally continue to improve in this offense. And this was a wide receiver 7 finish with an injured Dak Prescott last year. He played 5 games with no Dak Prescott, in which he only averaged 16.5 points per game. But with Dak Prescott, he was up at 18.5. Not to mention that this offense is probably going to look to throw the ball a little bit more this year than they did last year based off historical tendencies. So yeah, I'm all in on CeeDee Lamb here. A.J. Brown as our next guy. I mean, I like him, right? But this is going to be a super run-heavy offense. I expect the Eagles to lead the NFL in rushing this next season. With A.J. Brown, hard to go against them. Wide receiver 8 in fantasy last year. Plus, he averaged 2.8 yards per route run, had 99 intended air yards per game, had a target share mark at 27%. He's clearly an elite level talent, right? But you do have a lot of talent in this offense. Now, our next 2 guys will be Saquon Barkley and Nick Chubb. Now, with these running backs, you could move Chubb ahead of Barkley if you are playing in a non-PPR format. In a non-PPR format, go ahead, take Chubb. The reason I'm going to have Barkley here ahead of him is, I mean, the man was just the running back 5 last year. He averaged a 15.5% team target share, and he's only 26 years old. Generally, you're not having to worry about Saquon Barkley getting worse going into this next season. Whereas Chubb, a little bit on the older side, and while, yeah, we can project his receiving down volume to go up with no Kareem Hunt, at the same time, he was only at, I mean, a 6.85% team target share last year. So if you just compare him to Barkley in a full PPR format, I think the answer is clearly going to stay with Saquon. Now, our next guy, Tony Pollard, is moving up these rankings in dramatic fashion. Now, y'all know earlier this offseason, I was worried about drafting Ramondre Stevenson. I was worried about drafting Tony Pollard because all the sharks out there in the water. We were looking at Dalvin Cook. We were looking at Ezekiel Elliott, Leonard Fournette, Kareem Hunt. I mean, hell, maybe even Jonathan Taylor we'll talk about in just 1 second. And we were saying, okay, well, yeah, these running backs look great right now, but what happens if you add another guy into this offense? Well, now 2 of those sharks are out of the water. They've been caught, and Tony Pollard looks a little safer than he did previously. You have obviously all the volume volume there available with Ezekiel Elliott leaving. And I'm sorry for everybody who's all in on Deuce Vaughn this year. The 5-5 running back's not going to go ahead and take that Ezekiel Elliott volume. It ain't happening. Now, you still have to be just a little concerned that the Dallas Cowboys look to bring in another RB. But if they don't, by the time we get to the start of the season, Tony Pollard will be a tier ahead of where he is right now. Now, our next guy, Davante Adams, straight up dominant. I would say the best wide receiver in fantasy football since the year 2017. But this is also going to be the worst quarterback play that he's had since then, right? You also have to be a little bit more concerned about the age than you would have to be with someone like Stephon Diggs. I think it really is going to depend on the format that you're drafting on, because I see in like casual, just say redraft formats on ESPN, their Davante Adams is going ahead of CeeDee Lamb, ahead of AJ Brown. And honestly, I'm not going to get behind that. I don't think we can take Davante Adams there based off the red flag of Jimmy Garoppolo. But in underdog drafts, Davante Adams goes behind Garrett Wilson. Davante Adams goes behind Amon-Ra St. Brown. So over there, Adams is actually one of my most drafted elite level wide receivers. So you're getting him as like the wide receiver 10. Now, our next guy will be Garrett Wilson, where we primarily want to be focusing in on the usage with no Zach Wilson, right? Zach Wilson will not be playing this next year. And with Garrett Wilson, this is a wide receiver that averaged 17.3 points per game with no Zach Wilson as a rookie last season. Yes, that's with Mike White. That's with Joe Flacco. And he was already torching defenses. Now, we already have that fire going, and all you're doing is you are adding gasoline to it by adding Aaron Rodgers into this offense. You'd be so damn excited about Garrett Wilson. Now, our next guy with Amon-Ra St. Brown, I think you'd be pumped for as well, right? Year 2, he was the wide receiver 10 from a points per game perspective. He really comps, in my mind, to someone like Jarvis Landry, and that is not a slight to Amon-Ra St. Brown in the slightest. If you remember Jarvis back in Miami, there was a season where he led the NFL in receptions. I think that Amon-Ra St. Brown could easily lead the NFL in receptions this next season. Now, to be fair, I think you really want St. Brown in that full PPR league. If you're playing in a non-PPR format, probably not going to be as excited about it, just because if you look at those wide receivers that operate a little closer to the line of scrimmage, naturally their touchdown rate's going to be a lot lower than it would be otherwise. And we see that with Amon-Ra St. Brown only having 54 intended air yards per game last season. Now, our next guy will be Jonathan Taylor. And we said it with Saquon Barkley. We said it with Josh Jacobs. And I'll repeat it with Jonathan Taylor. These running backs that want new contracts have so little leverage that it's better to just treat them as if they're playing this next season. Now, of course, I can't guarantee that with Jonathan Taylor, right? If I could guarantee that with Jonathan Taylor, he would be at the very top of this tier. But right now in underdog drafts, if you are going to continue to get JT as your running back 3, say in a $5 puppy draft where you can win $200,000 with first place, how are you going to find someone with a higher ceiling than round 3 Jonathan Taylor? This is a running back that was drafted number 1 overall in fantasy drafts last year. Last year he had a 67% market share as a rusher, a 10% team target share, while at the same time, the man is 24, 25 years old. Yeah, so I'm still going through taking the shot on JT. Now, our next guy will be Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry, very similar to Davante Adams. If you were drafting in like your regular ESPN league and you're having to take Derrick Henry over Nick Chubb, makes no sense to. Derrick Henry pushing 30 at this point. If we go through and look at the red flags, one, the fact that pretty much consensus across the board, everybody has the Tennessee Titans as the worst offensive line in the NFL. And 2, almost more importantly, Derrick Henry is pushing 30 years old at this point. So if we look at all running backs that had a similar age 29 season to Derrick Henry last year, you are going to see since the year 2000, according to the Road of his screener, every single one of these guys got worse. Arian Foster, who at his peak was elite. Went from 21 points per game to then getting injured the following season. LaShawn McCoy, who at his peak was elite, went from 20 points per game down to 16.5. Curtis Martin went from 19 points per game down to 15. Marshawn Lynch went from 19 points per game down to 12. DeMarco Murray went from 18.5 points per game down to 11.5. Derrick Henry is going from 20 points per game to, I don't know. I'm not saying it's going to be 11. By no means am I saying that's going to happen. But at the same time, I'm going to say it's very reckless for you to ignore the historical trends that we have had since the year 2000 and to assume that Derrick Henry will be the first running back to break this. Now, that being said, if you're going to draft him at the 2-3 turn in an underdog draft, love it. Just in your regular redraft league, if you're going to have to take him over Nick Chubb, I don't see the reason to. Now, our next guy with Josh Jacobs, who's been going in the middle of round 3 in underdog drafts. Looks like he's going to be back and playing this next year. You know, he was my most drafted player in fantasy football last year, won us a lot of money. He was the running back 3 from a points per game perspective. He averaged 20 carries per game. He averaged 120 total yards per game as well. I know a lot of people are concerned based off the workload that he had last year, how that may translate going into this next season. I will tomorrow be doing an in-depth historical analysis of running backs that are coming off massive seasons and what we typically see the following year, just to give everybody a sense of what we may be able to expect with Jacobs. I'll give you a little sneak peek. I'm not worried. Now, our next year will be led off with Jalen Waddle, our most drafted wide receiver in fantasy last year as well. This year, much harder to get him, right? You have to draft him in round 2, where last year you were getting him in the middle rounds. Still like him a ton. I mean, I think that in Miami, you're going to have such a concentrated target share between Tyreek Hill and Waddle, where you can still confidently draft them. Now, our next 3 players will be the elite level quarterbacks. We're going to go Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, and Josh Allen. Now, Hurts will be my quarterback 1 in a 4-point passing touchdown format, because in that 4-point passing touchdown league, obviously rushing touchdowns for the quarterback position are going to be worth significantly more than passing touchdowns, approximately about 50% more if we're going to be exact. Now, if you're playing in a 6-point passing touchdown format, just because the passing volume, then at that point you would move Mahomes ahead of Hurts. But in general, these guys all can score 400 plus points this next season. Their production is super predictable. Not only is it predictable, but it's going to be something that very few players in fantasy football can possibly come close to. So yeah, I'm completely fine taking these elite level quarterbacks at the 2-3 turn in fantasy drafts this next year. Now, our next player will be Chris Olave at 25. I love me some Chris Olave, if I'm going to be honest with you. Now, yes, with Andy Dalton last year, it's not like Chris Olave won fantasy football leagues, but it was with Andy Dalton. Dalton pushing 34, 35. Okay. Now, if we go ahead and look at how good Chris Olave was as a rookie, and we take the team situation out of it, and we really only look at his receiving yards per game and his market share numbers. So how many targets is he drawing in comparison to the other options in his offense? The only rookies since the year 2000 to have comparable numbers were Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Odell Beckham Jr., Mike Evans, Keenan Allen, Julio Jones, AJ Green. Every single one of these wide receivers at one point was a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy. I believe at some point in Chris Olave's NFL career, he will be a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy, just like everybody that had his same profile before him. Now the question is that in year 2, and is that with Derek Carr? Personally, I am not a massive Derek Carr guy. I really wish that this would have been the team that had Aaron Rodgers, right? I mean, if the New Orleans Saints had Rodgers and the Jets had Derek Carr, you would see Garrett Wilson down here at 25 for us and Chris Olave up there at 16. Now, our next year will be led off with Mark Andrews. Very similar to what we were discussing previously with Travis Kelce. If you're in that league where you only have one flex spot, or if it's a 10-team or fewer format where you're just going to have such easy access to grabbing wide receiver values later on in your draft, there, honestly, you probably push Mark Andrews up a bit in these rankings. Now, of course, if you're playing in a league where maybe you start 3 wide receivers and you have 2 to 3 flex spots at the same time, then in that instance, tight end's going to be significantly less important, as they're going to make up a smaller percentage of your starting lineup output. And then at that point, you would be moving Mark Andrews down these rankings. So please make sure you understand your league format and how that's going to change the positional value in how you should approach your draft. Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to be looking at T. Higgins. With Higgins, he fell off last year. He did not fall off last year. Now, he had a couple of games where we thought he was going to start. We thought he was going to play, but he was banged up. And yeah, I told a lot of people to play T. Higgins just for him to go out there and run one route and then stand on the sideline for the rest of the game. Now, because he did that to us, I mean, it's going to hurt my feelings a bit, but at the same time, it's going to skew his per game statistics on what you had last season. So if last year we go back and we remove every week that T. Higgins played fewer than 30% of the snaps, that's going to be week 5, week 1, week 14, and week 17. T. Higgins was the wide receiver 12 in fantasy, repeating exactly what he did the year prior. The wide receiver 12 in 2021, the wide receiver 12 in 2022. He's stepping into his prime, as Joe Burrow is also stepping into his prime and possibly the best offense in the NFL this next season. Now, going over to our next player, Devonta Smith, just has a lot of target competition, right? You have A.J. Brown, you have Dallas Goedert. It's a super run-heavy team. But I do want to illustrate that this Devonta Smith ranking, as well as the A.J. Brown ranking, is kind of why I have Jalen Hurts as my quarterback one in fantasy this next year. Because if you look at the way that these pass catchers project in this offense, there's almost no way that the Philadelphia Eagles see a massive fall off. Because if the Eagles were to see that massive fall off, who is going to hurt you most in fantasy football drafts? Is it going to be taking A.J. Brown round 1? Is it going to be taking Jalen Hurts or Devonta Smith at the 2-3 turn? It's probably going to be the wide receivers, because even if the Eagles are to be very bad in the passing game, still with Jalen Hurts' rushing upside, you could still see him go out there and be a top 5 quarterback in fantasy. So, I mean, yeah, Smith, we're going to rank him here because I think this offense is going to be great. But I do want to just go back to us like highlighting why Jalen Hurts is my quarterback one in the first place and how it's hard to get away from him just having a monster season this next year. Now, our next guy will be Lamar Jackson at 29. Lamar is another rushing quarterback, similar to Hurts, similar to Fields, that you're way more excited about having in a 4-point passing touchdown league in comparison to his 6-point passing touchdown league. Now, with that being said, the reason I've been drafting Lamar Jackson nonstop at the 3-4 turn in underdog drafts is we have seen a higher ceiling from Lamar Jackson at the quarterback position than any other player in fantasy football history. If we go since the year 2000, the highest scoring quarterback seasons from a points per game perspective, Lamar Jackson in 2019. After that, Peyton Manning in 2013, Aaron Rodgers 2011, Mahomes 2018, Jalen Hurts 2022, Michael Vick 2010, and Mahomes in 2020. So, I mean, if we're looking at this list as well, I do want to illustrate why Jalen Hurts is still going to be my quarterback one. Last year, I mean, the man put up a top 5 quarterback season of all time. Now, going over to our next player, we are going to be looking at ETN. Now, previous to this, we actually had some wide receivers in this range. But now that you have Ramondre Stevenson as well as Breece Hall falling, based off the additions of both Dalvin Cook as well as Ezekiel Elliott, kind of muddying up those backfields just a bit, all of a sudden, I would want to just pivot over to someone like ETN, where, yeah, Tank Bigsby's going to have a role this next year. I mean, Bigsby's looked phenomenal, right? But still, you're expecting like a 30% usage mark for Tank Bigsby. You're really hoping that Travis Etienne's going to get closer to about 70%. What you're really hoping in the case of Travis Etienne is that he goes out there and he actually gives you a Saquon Barkley type ascension catching the football. If Etienne can do what he did at Clemson in the receiving game, then Travis Etienne can be a top 5 running back in fantasy this next year. But I think that's all I have for you. Again, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for checking out this video. If you haven't already, go down there, drop a like, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if you want to get in a draft with us tonight, tomorrow, the next day, we're streaming every single night Underdog Fantasy Football drafts. They're best balls to no time commitment at all during the year. So I drafted 700 teams, won $150,000 last season. If you use promo code FLOCK, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. Plus, you're going to get our 2023 fantasy football rankings, a free trial to flockfantasy.com where you can find our 2023 fantasy football draft guide. And make sure you are taking advantage of the Flock exclusive special pick'em. Josh Allen, more than less than half a passing yard for week 1, because I did go out there and work my butt off to get you that. But thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. I really do appreciate you and really hope I get a draft with you in a live stream later tonight.